I started my career in broadcasting in 1969. I was a young college student, sophomore year, Houston, Texas, and I was a pretend hippie walking around wearing my peasant blouses and my bell-bottom jeans, but I was dead broke. And my boyfriend at the time worked for a radio station, KTRH. And he said, there is an opening for a weekend writer. You could apply for that. So I did. I went and asked the news director, and he said, well, sure, can you type? And I said, yeah, that's all he asked. Could I type? And I said, yes. I couldn't. But he said, okay, you start next Saturday. Well, I had to teach myself to type in 1 week, which I did. And then I started my shift on Saturday. I worked 2 days a week, Saturday and Sunday, 9 hours straight, no breaks, 2 newscasts an hour. And I worked for these 2 older men who had covered World War II, I think. They were as old as my dad. But they were great. They taught me everything, and everything that I needed to know at the time. Rip and read journalism, and how to do phoners and record them on a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and how to cut it and how to write around it. And it was terrific training ground. It really was. I love that job. I love radio. And then they opened a hard rock FM side, and because I was the youngest one at the station, and in fact I was the only woman at the station also at the time. But they chose me to be the news person on the hard rock station that they were marketing to young people like me. So I did then on air. I started reading the news myself. And that led to a job in New York City in 1973. I got a job with ABC Network Radio. That was the summer of the Watergate hearings. Great time to be in the news business. But it was a summer replacement job. And at the end of the summer, I heard that there might be a chance for me to go back to Texas and get into television. And I applied to the guy who was going to be the news director at WFAA TV in Dallas. And he said, send me some writing samples, which I did. And he hired me, sight unseen. So back to Texas I went, and I got into television. Sexism really became an issue when I got to television, to Dallas in 1973. I was originally in the newsroom as a producer, but then I was sent to Fort Worth as a reporter. And at that point, the women in the Dallas newsroom filed a complaint with the EEOC asking for equal pay, and they had a good case. And I was asked to sign on to the case, and I refused. I didn't do it. I liked my job. I needed my job. I was making enough money to support myself, and I didn't want to rock the boat. And I'm really proud of them for doing what they did. They won. They got back pay. I didn't. But they were at the forefront of that movement. And I wasn't much of a feminist at the time. I realized that. But some of us were and some of us weren't. Same with the men. The men were sometimes sexist, and many of them were not. Many of them were very helpful to us in our careers. And I want to acknowledge them because they deserve it. Sexual harassment is a different issue, and that certainly was also, I think, more prominent in the TV newsrooms than in the radio newsrooms, from my experience. And they ranged from serious sexual harassment, like the correspondent who asked me to sleep with him because he could help my career if I slept with him. And I said no. To people who would grab your breasts and then say they were just kidding. And frankly, they probably were kidding, and it was sexual harassment, but I let it go also because I love my job. I love my work, and I didn't want to lose it. So that was tough, and I'm glad women don't have to deal with it as much as we did, but it certainly existed. My first love was producing the shows. I loved to produce newscasts. I loved to be in the control room. I loved the timing. We had to back time the show ourselves in our heads. And it was great working with the sports guy and the weather guy and the anchor people, getting the timing just right, stacking the show, getting the right lead story, getting the right closer. That was my first love. But I did also serve my time as a reporter. And I got to cover some great stories, actually. Because I was sent to Fort Worth, I got to be where the West begins. That's what Fort Worth says it is, and of course I believe it. But because you're in Fort Worth, you get to see and do stories of these beautiful museums, the Carter and the Kimball. You get to cover the Fort Worth stockyards, which is, of course, kind of the middle of the cattle drive from Mexico up to Montana. And at the time, they were revitalizing the stockyards, so that was fun. And I got to be in little towns that other people didn't know, like Wizard Wells.
You have to come pretty far out of your way off the Jacksboro Highway to find Wizard Wells because it's not the big town it once was. In fact, only about a dozen families live here now.
And got to be sent to the Terlingua chili cook-off. And another thing that was happening in Texas at the time, a little mini revolution, was in country music. Willie Nelson had come back from Nashville, and there were some brilliant singer-songwriters in Texas working at the time.
One of those stars is 32-year-old Ray Wiley Hubbard of Dallas, who has become a cornerstone of progressive country music.
And so I got to do stories on the change in country music, and that was a really big deal for Texas. And I did funny stories too, things that I now shake my head and go, why in the world was I assigned to that?
They call him Freight Train for obvious reasons. He's a stock show bum. He makes them all from Denver to Houston. Freight Train makes money helping with animals and cleaning trailers, and he earns all the beer he can drink by entertaining the crowd.
Some of the big stories I covered were the Cullen Davis murder trial. He was a Fort Worth millionaire who lived in a mansion, and he was separated from his wife. And she was quite controversial because she wasn't the regular Fort Worth socialite kind of gal. But there was a shootout at the mansion. A guy came dressed in black and a wig and shot her boyfriend and shot their daughter inside the house first. And it was awful. Also, a young man was maimed, but he was put on trial for the murder, and they moved it to Amarillo. And I did a story about the sequestration of the jurors.
He can watch TV only at certain times in a special room down the hall, and only with a bailiff present who will turn it off when the news shows come on.
And then I covered the whole trial all the way through. He was acquitted. And then he was later tried for another case, but long forgotten, but it was an important case for me. And my lesson from that is make sure that you get to know all of the parties in the lawsuit, because I got to know the defense attorney, I got to know the prosecutor, and that helped me cover the story, I think, better. Probably the biggest story I covered when I worked at WFAA was the Huntsville prison siege.
Since Wednesday, a group of convicts headed by murderer Fred Gomez Carrasco have held 11 hostages in the state prison at Huntsville, Texas.
Outside, the prison is surrounded by guards carrying rifles and shotguns, and both sides are negotiating.
And so we all camped out at the Huntsville prison, living in the yard for many days. And because I speak Spanish, the prison officials were concerned that the one inmate who spoke no English was not getting the settlement deal correctly from the guy who was heading up the outbreak. So they asked me if I would get on the phone with him and tell him what the deal was in Spanish. So that meant that I, as a reporter, would be negotiating with a hostage taker, with an inmate. And I was young and didn't understand what that meant. So I called Marty Haig, the news director, and I said, here's what they want me to do. And he said, you cannot negotiate. You cannot do that, but you can interview him. So in the course of the interview, of course, I could ask him if he knew what the deal was. And so that worked out really well. I got an exclusive story out of it. And they got what they wanted out of it. And eventually the whole story ended in a bloody shootout at the end, and that's unfortunate. But it was quite a dramatic story, and we were all pinned in the yard for a long time. Another very important story I did with photographer Barbara Clark was a special series on wife abuse. I think that would be very hard for a man to do back in the 70s, maybe even today, but it is an indication of how important a woman's perspective is in the news business, then and now.
But women who live in neighborhoods like this one hide their problem more often. As one counselor put it, these women would die of humiliation if their bridge club knew. In other neighborhoods, the reasons are different, but the problem is the same. Because wife beating, like alcoholism, has no respect for class or color or lifestyle.
There were several times I couldn't go to work because of the bruises on my face and on my neck. I have teeth marks on my arm, on my left arm.
Fort Worth Police Training for Signal 15s, domestic disturbances. They train because it is one of their most dangerous assignments. More police officers are killed and injured running family disturbance calls than any other. Wife abuse is an illness, like child abuse and alcoholism. And until enough people are able to talk about it freely and openly, those involved will continue to hide. But what many are hoping for is the day that wives and husbands will be able to admit the problem. Only then, they say, will wife abuse be a treatable illness.
When my daughter Miranda was born in 1980, joy of my life, I was then hired at KPRC TV in Houston, and we moved to Houston, and I was a producer, a show producer, but we noticed that there were more people coming from Central America than ever before. And I convinced the news director that we should send me and a photographer to El Salvador to report on the war that was sending refugees into Houston. And he agreed. And we turned it into a special report, a series of special reports on the situation in Central America. And from there, I went to NBC News in Burbank and continued to work in Central America, covering Nicaragua, the Contra War, Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama, the whole area, and South America, because at the time in the 80s, South America was going through a series of democratic revolutions. So that was kind of my beat. And from there, I became the bureau chief in Israel during the first Intifada. So from the frying pan into the fire, I guess you could say. That was generally my beat with NBC. I had a great career, wonderful time. I was also fortunate to work with some wonderful women in the business. As we were all growing in the business, we were all learning together, some of them faster than others. But in the Dallas newsroom, of course, we had Iola Johnson as our anchor, and Kay Vinson and Rita Flynn and Jane Horowitz and Linda Metcalf, great women to work with. Also during this time, I was lucky to work with a photojournalist, a female photojournalist, the only one we had. She might have been the first one in Texas, I don't know. Her name is Barbara Clark. We are still fast friends. We made friends doing our news stories, and they often put us together on assignments. I think they just thought the girls would like to be together. I'm not really sure. But we did like to be together, and we did have a good time. And one time we talked them into letting us do a tour of the Texas Panhandle, and we set up stories along the way.
This could be any mist-covered morning on a Texas farm in 1915. It's supposed to look like it and feel like it. The Sauer-Beckman farm has been frozen in time to 1915, so you don't read history or see it boxed into display cabinets, but feel it live.
And we did stories about the sunflower crops and the development of the wine industry in the Panhandle, and God only knows what other stories we did, but we had a great time. She was a great journalist, and she taught me about writing to film and how to edit your story, and she was a great partner to work with. Well, I guess if I had any advice for journalists who are working today, I would say, keep learning, keep improving your skills. Don't stop learning. It's really important to know that you have to keep improving as you go along. And don't let your ego get in the way. This job is not about you. It's not about how much money you make. It's not about how much airtime you get. It's about those people out there. They really need a voice, and you are that voice. And finally, don't let journalism die. Keep it up. Defend it. Fight for it. Our democracy really does depend on it. You know, when I think back on it, the best thing about those years I spent in radio and television were the friends I made for life, who are still my friends. It's amazing. We went through a lot together. We struggled, we laughed, We teamed up, we produced a product together, and I'm still friends with a lot of those people. And it is the joy of my life to have made friends in the business. So I hope you do too.
We don't have anything in the first segment.
You're kidding me.
No, I'm not kidding you.
Hello, EDR. Get a tape rolling right now.
In the break, 110.
I'll tell you what. Just put it in Cassidy. I'm gonna feed both of them. I'll feed